across time. If you read the Gulag Archipelago, for example, Solzhenitsyn does a masterful job of indicating how the consequences, the brutal tyrannical actions of Lenin and Stalin were necessary concomitants to or necessary outcomes of the axioms that were embedded in the communist worldview. They weren't deviations from some properly utopian norm. They were exactly what you'd expect if you put those principles into operation. And I see similar things going on around us now. Let's say on the politically correct front, I don't really believe there's a conspiracy of politically correct people who are meeting in secret to direct the world, although if there was, the WEF would probably qualify. But I do think that systems of ideas can act as conspiratorial agents. Now, in this case, it's more complex, though. So there's a cartel who's pushing forward this narrative. And the question is, well, or a system of ideas that's generating it. And the question is, well, to what end? That's one question. And the other question is, who benefits? Now, and then the further question is, why would the media, for example, fall into lockstep, shoulder-to-shoulder cooperation with those who benefit? Now, we know perfectly well that the biggest punitive civil lawsuits ever levied in the United States were levied successfully against pharmaceutical companies. And the left has every reason to be entirely skeptical about pharmaceutical companies, like they have been for the last 5 decades. But all of a sudden, we saw this massive spin around where everything the pharmaceutical companies said was taken as gospel. And it's very hard to suppress the suspicions that something like massive lobbying and very narrow profit seeking were driving this. What's your sense of the underlying motivation?
So I completely agree with you that this, what I described as a small cartel, was operating in the context of a very complex environment. And in that environment, many people took advantage of the opportunities provided to them by the set of events that unfolded. But let me defend the characterization of this as at least initiated. I personally blame public health. Public health authorities, the top public health authorities in the world and the top public health authorities in the United States and elsewhere, for the set of events that transpired in response.
And let's name some names on that front.
Yeah, so like in the United States, a primary architect of the lockdown strategy was Tony Fauci. Now, let me just describe why I think this wasn't. It's not a conspiracy in a sense that there's this like small group that has nefarious ideas. If you look at the decades before the pandemic happened, there was a concerted effort in the United States and elsewhere to prepare for the next pandemic. That preparation involved putting into actuality a whole range of powers that previously we would have said were not consistent with liberal democracy. Powers to close you into your home, to close your business, to close your schools. Powers to basically force you to test and isolate if you're found positive. A whole range of almost dictatorial powers that would have been previously unimaginable. And the idea was that we are biohazards to each other. And the whole goal is, if we can keep each other apart during a time of severe infectious disease threat, it will actually save lives. Mm-hmm. That was the premise of this, and that there was coming a new respiratory virus pandemic threat. Now that was certain to be true. Mm-hmm. We've had respiratory virus pandemics time after time, decade after decade. In the 20th century, we had respiratory virus pandemics. 1918, of course, now is the most famous, but we had them in 1957, 1968, 1976. You could just keep going on and on. Most recently, maybe 2009 and the swine flu pandemic. So there was this infrastructure set up, and this sort of ideology among the top scientific bureaucrats in this country and elsewhere that because a respiratory virus pandemic was coming, we needed better tools than we previously had to address it. And for them, the better tools meant essentially the dictatorial powers, the authoritarian powers that constitute a lockdown. And now when COVID arrived, and we can talk about what exactly how it arrived, but let's just take that as a given that it arrived. That entire infrastructure sort of powered into existence, and part of that infrastructure involves making sure that the people take the measures that are being proposed seriously, that the threat seriously. And the way they did that is by spreading panic and fear about the disease. In that environment, what happened was that a small group of people at the head, like Tony, let's just name names, Tony Fauci, he donned on himself the mantle of science itself, right? We're all looking for a guru.
He took the name of science in vain.
He actually did. I mean, he talks about it as if it's some sort of religious system. So he took, and what he did is he designed a set of policies, an ethos that said, if you do these things, then I will rescue you from the threat that is going all around you, that's in the air everywhere, where even your children are a biohazard to you, a threat to you.
Yeah.
And in that, so when that set of events unfolds, right, you have someone who essentially takes over what truth is in the minds of everybody. Then all these other actors could come in and start to say, you mentioned the pharmaceutical companies. They jumped in, I don't think they were in a nefarious plot. I think that they jumped in legitimately saying, okay, let's help figure out how to address this threat. Yeah. Now then they took advantage of the power they had in very abusive ways, but that's a later development rather than the driving force, I think.
And so how do you understand